We all in this room have a common goal. That's the opening theme of this conference, combating climate change. And the question is, can we get there from here using nuclear power? I have to admit, I have expected a lot more fireworks than we've had so far. So we'll see if we get those fireworks in this Q&A. Before we begin, I'd like to get a pulse of the room. And the question before us is do we need nuclear power in order to address the issue of climate change? And I'm going to ask you to raise your hand either yes or no, or I'm still undecided, just so we can get a sense of the pulse in the room. So, we need nuclear power to address climate change. Raise your hand if the answer is yes. That looks like about 70% of the room. How many people say no? That looks to me like about 10% of the room. How many people don't know? And that looks like about 20%. It's amazing how that math worked. We do not represent the American public. The majority of the American public does not support nuclear power. So we do have a skew in this room on how to think about this issue. This is an issue that involves pragmatic and analytical thinking, but also emotional and ideological thinking. And a lot of passionate positions on this issue, which led me to, when I was asked to moderate this panel, having images of Matt Lauer in my head as I play the role of moderator. But to get us started, let me ask your help once more. When I was listening to the talks, I was trying to write down what were the common themes, what were the issues on the table that might also inform the conversation that moves forward. And I wrote down 7. And it seems to me these are the 7 issues that if you support nuclear power, I would ask which ones of these are the most important that you think nuclear has to address in order to move forward. If you oppose it, what's the primary reason why you oppose it? If you don't know, answer it any way you want. But I see 7 issues. 1 is waste disposal. 1 is safety, meltdowns. That's 2. 3 is weapons proliferation. 4 is around construction, both the cost and the time lag to set them up, to get them going, as Mark talked about quite extensively. The next one is around the feasibility of alternatives. Do we even need nuclear, or can we get there with renewables? And there seems to be some seeming trade-off. And then the 6th, I actually have only 6, markets. You know, Ted talked about this a lot with, Bill talked about this a lot, that markets are not working correctly. The cost of energy is too low, and there's a lack of cost transparency. So, 6 issues on the table. Which one do you think is most important? Number 1, waste disposal. Just a few. Safety. Barely anybody. Weapons proliferation. Barely anybody. This is very strange. Construction. Cost and time to get online. Okay, a lot of hands go up. The feasibility of alternatives, whether renewables can do it on their own or whether renewables cannot do it on their own. Okay, a little more. And then finally, markets not working. Okay, so it sounds to me like construction, markets, then feasibility are where we need to focus our attention, but I don't want to leave waste disposal, safety, and weapons proliferation on the side. So let's start with cost and construction. I am not an expert on nuclear power. You guys are. Help us understand this. I heard a lot of talk about molten salt, small modular, lattice-enabled nuclear reactors. Can these bring the cost down? Can we actually have nuclear that's feasible in terms of cost and bringing online? Who would like to start us? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think these both the cost and market questions they're both very tied up together. And I think you saw it in a bunch of the back and forth prior to this, which is, you can't even get agreement on what anything costs, or what it should cost. Mm-hmm. One man's market distortion is another man's market externality. The cost of things really depends on the institutions. In the institutional framework. We talk a lot about energy markets as if energy systems actually operate in anything that looks like a market in any way that an economist would recognize as a market. So I think you have to look at all of those things and go, what do we care about? And what are we willing to do in terms of how we set ourselves up to deal with this problem? Frankly, if we really thought about climate change like a looming existential threat, like an asteroid headed for the planet, I do not believe that the thing that we would then do is to say, so let's put a price on asteroid destruction and incentivize the private market to go blow up the asteroid. That's not how we'd solve that problem. We would go build zero carbon technology in a systematic, integrated way as fast as we could.
Nor would we say that it'll take us 10 years to get a building permit to build a rocket
right,
launcher.
And we would, yes, we would take a different view. We would not, as Mark does, take major low carbon technologies off the table. And in fact, if you look at the rates at which, historically as opposed to in models, different technologies have scaled, nuclear scaled faster than anything else.
But we
do. So I'm getting to if we really were like, it's an asteroid, we have to deal with it as fast as possible. We wouldn't be talking about markets. We would just basically build existing nuclear plants as fast as we could. Now, as I said during my talk, I don't think we're going to do it because I think no matter what people say, when you really look at how we behave, we don't view this as that kind of existential threat. And so then we get into questions of economics and institutions. And that's where I think we have to, when I look pragmatically at the kinds of things we're willing and not willing to do politically and institutionally, I go, you're going to need nuclear that we can build in liberalized economic contexts that's cheaper, smaller, that you can crank off of assembly lines, things like that. And if you don't do that, I think the nuclear future is going to be limited. So
but can, all of you, can we bring the cost down? And going to Mark's point, your point almost seemed to be, it's too late. By the time they come online, it's too late. So can we shorten the time? Even, is it a permitting issue? Is it a building issue? We're not practiced at doing it. Bill?
Yeah. It's alive. Okay. Well, I think that it's important to take this perspective, and that is that we hadn't built a nuclear power plant in the United States since really built and completed a nuclear power plant since really the 1970s. So we really didn't have the practice, didn't have the experience to do this in quite some time. So now we have 4 reactors under construction today, and it took some time to get those projects off the ground. There were some fits and starts, but really, when you think about them as first-of-a-kind projects, they really weren't that bad. As a matter of fact, the projects are a couple years behind schedule, but the cost is coming out pretty close to what was projected. So it's really not been that bad. It's actually been pretty good. And when I talk to the companies involved, they say the projects still make economic sense. They still like the decision. They still think it's good. And now, at least for one technology, the AP1000 technology, we've now gone through the process of actually getting one licensed and under construction. And so when the next one comes, if it comes within the next, say, 5 to 10 years, we'll know how to build it pretty effectively, and we'll be able to beat that long-term horizon we heard about earlier. Now that the project would use a certified technology, that all the bugs have been worked out as far as the construction process, you'll probably build one in 5 years pretty handily. But it took us this point to get to that stage.
We have a question here that I think you can answer that builds on what you're saying. Why do we continue to have reactor designs certified in every individual country? Why can't we let the IAEA or some other international organization certify reactor designs and speed this process up?
Because we don't like people outside of the country telling us what to do. That's why. And all countries feel that way. All countries expect that their regulators are going to represent their interests and make decisions based on what their country thinks is safe. And I don't think that I would be comfortable in having a regulator in any country, I mean, in Spain, telling Americans, don't worry, just go ahead and build it, it's going to be fine. Now, we do that to some degree in the aircraft industry, so there's a precedent for doing it. But for nuclear, I just don't think it's going to be possible. And regulators around the world have talked about, are there ways we can work more closely together to facilitate a more of an international cooperation approach? And I think the answer is yes. But to actually get to the place where we actually have international licensing, I just don't think that's going to happen. foreseeable future.
Mark, can we bring the cost down? Can we speed this up so that this becomes less of an issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of the cost increases are due to delays, and even the graph that Ted's referring to where there was a fast build-out, that was just the construction time. If you actually look at those data, the build-out started in 1975, but the planning started in 1965. So everybody refers to the fast time it took to put up a bunch of reactors, but they're just looking at the construction time, not the actual planning and siting of the plants. But even the cost today, whenever you hear about a new nuclear reactor going up, it's always, oh yeah, the costs are going to be low. But then there's always a delay. And even, Watts Bar, it's not even running. They shut it down indefinitely because of a fire or something like that recently. So that's another delay. But I think there was a Georgia plant that's delayed like 3 years. There's continuous delay in Finland. They have delayed plants. It's the delays that keep causing the cost to go up, and so there's always this underestimate by the lowballing, basically, of the cost.
That doesn't happen in China or Korea.
Or
Russia.
Mark, you're
Well, let me
cherry
finish.
picking your
Okay,
examples.
take China. They have low cost of labor, so they can get it done cheaper.
Well, why would low cost of labor allow you to get it done on time?
But they're not. When you say on
Your
time,
argument's about time. Mark.
the time again in China. If you look at their overall time from planning to operation, it's still 10 to 19 years.
Well,
Might be closer to 10 years, but it's still not. It's not 4 years.
Well, I take 10 years. That's a pretty. France decarbonized. I'll grant you 1965 and not 75. They still decarbonized their entire electrical system in less than 3 decades.
Yeah, okay, but I'm saying you've got to look at the whole picture. It's the cost, the weapons proliferation.
France has the lowest wholesale prices in Europe.
If you want to electrify the whole world with nuclear, you need 16,000 reactors. Okay, we have 400 today. So if you double it to 800, that's 5% only of the energy of the world. That means more countries in the world will have nuclear energy and some percent of them will try to go to nuclear weapons. This is a big issue.
But there's absolutely no, you use a very particular construction. You say, well, they sort of hid behind an energy program. There's just no evidence that any country in the world has actually legitimately started a civilian energy program and then transformed it into a weapons program. It works the other way around. It always has, Mark.
Well, Iran, it's a prime example of that. It did. And
what was?
Iran. They
No,
hit it as a civilian nuclear
no one
energy
has
program.
had. Iran has had a civilian nuclear plant using different technology for like 3 decades, and they didn't start building. There were no one. The Iranians, IAEA, the international community, no one was under any illusions what the Iranians were doing when they started buying up lots and lots of enrichment.
But Ted, are you saying that weapons proliferation is not an issue?
I'm not saying that weapons proliferation is a big issue, and it does not come from civilian nuclear power programs. It never has.
Testing. I said both civilian and test research reactors.
Well, demonstrate even the same is the case. You can look at the North Koreans. You can look at it, and no one was ever under any illusion what they were up to. They claimed it was a demonstration reactor, and the whole world knew they were building a weapon and tried to stop them.
It was under the guise of civilian nuclear
It was-
energy.
but
That
under
enabled
the-
them
I
to
mean,
employ
Okay,
it.
okay.
You
I
can
get the
justify it
sense.
any way you want.
I get the sense you guys have debated each other before. Let's move to the second issue that seemed to dominate people's attention, and that was markets. And the markets are not working. Energy is too cheap. Certainly we have natural gas to thank for a lot of that. What can we do? What can you expect to try and address this issue? Is it as simple as a carbon price? What would you like to see as an intervention in the market to fix the problems that Bill talked about? Anyone?
You make cheap energy cleaner than fossil fuels, and that solves the problem. I think it's not a question of markets, it's a question of going to new technology. The molten salt reactor is so much cheaper than the 50-year-old crap that we're playing with, that will be transformative.
But if they were so cheap, wouldn't companies be
proliferation
doing
negative
that?
because we'll be able to put old warheads into it, and it won't be useful in the proliferation effort.
I think the real issue really is that what we need is a framework that enables every energy technology, whether it's molten salt reactors or solar or wind or anything else, to simply be brought onto the market on an equal basis. Mm-hmm. And so that we aren't slanting the playing field one way or another out of ideological concerns. Let's provide a level playing field. I think that's what we really need to do. And I don't think that that's that difficult, really. It's just because we've introduced distortions into the market. They weren't always there. We've created a lot.
But in fairness to that point, and this is a point that Paul Edwards brought up once at a conference recently, is that there's a lot of infrastructure in place that will advantage a particular technology. So you can't just simply instantly level the playing field and call it level. Just by
I think as we were talking about earlier, I think carbon taxes are the equalizer. The carbon taxes make because we were seeing numbers from different speakers that the solar PV prices have come down dramatically over the last couple of decades. Wind power is becoming cheaper. So you add a carbon tax on top of that, then it makes it much easier to make the choice to go to wind power or solar as opposed to a fossil fuel facility.
Would any of you advocate an energy policy that starts to subsidize particular technologies given the existential threat we face?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that I think that carbon pricing and sort of level playing fields are sort of they are a projection screen upon which everybody can project their preferred future outcomes. I mean, the reality is that there's really not much evidence because of the path-dependent nature of energy systems. Mostly what carbon prices do is they drive improving efficiencies within the existing fossil energy regimes, and they drive fuel switching within those regimes. There's not much evidence that pricing at any level that certainly any policymaker is seriously considering is a primary driver of switching from carbon to zero.
And that last phrase is the key point. And again, because if you talk about carbon pricing at $20 a ton or something like that, you do exactly what you say. You just get more efficient. You don't change anything. You have to really go up to pretty high levels. But again, are we serious about this or not? And if we're serious about it, then you have to introduce it.
I don't think we're serious about it. I don't say that dismissively. I don't say then we shouldn't care about it. I don't think that we are through, tax shifting or getting rid of income taxes. I don't think that we are going to change the politics such that you'll get very high carbon prices. I do not think that we're going to do French or Chinese style deployment of nuclear to solve the problem. Nor do I think that we're going to reorganize the whole global energy economy around intermittent renewables. So I start my consideration of how you deal with climate there. So what do you have to do? One, to some degree, and until we have really radically disruptive technologies, we're all lukewarmists. We're not stabilizing at 1.5 or 2 degrees. I don't think any serious economist will tell you that we are. Second, we've got to deploy everything that we have as fast as we can to get as far as we can. And I think the only thing that will really be game-changing and sort of change the basic realities of the global energy political economy is what Carl says. It's really, really cheap, scalable, dispatchable, zero-carbon energy, and we don't have it right now.
We had it in 1974 until President Nixon shut it down, and we can get it back, and we have a representative of a company trying to do that. But there's no point in arguing about whether your 1964 VW Bug is safe enough, and there's no reason to argue about whether the light water reactor is cheap enough. It's not. But that's not relevant. We need to move forward with new technology. And 50-year-old technology is, way out of date. Don't worry about it.
Let me push forward. So we started the idea that the market as a prison exists, the open free market is not getting us where we need to go. Some support for energy policy. A lot of people have pointed out that France's decarbonization path has been highly efficient and effective, but EDF is largely a state-owned enterprise. Can they, should we move towards state-owned enterprise? I have to add to that everyone extols the virtues of China and what they're doing. But I remember when Thomas Friedman got it right between the eyes for saying, look at China, they can get it done on climate change, and everyone just went at him for that. So how do we balance that?
The key is really quite simple. What people who build any energy technology, if they're doing it on a private sector basis, have to have some clarity that they can make their money back, right? That's really all there is to it. So in the U.S., in states like Georgia, They have regulated markets. The traditional regulated approaches where state regulators decide, here's how much you can charge for electricity for this asset. And that gives certainty to the investors. If you're in a market where the prices could be at $30 today, but might be -1 tomorrow, there's no certainty there, and it's hard to make an investment. So what you have to do is find a way to stabilize the pricing situation. In the UK, they went to the strike price approach, where there's a guaranteed price that was very controversial to some degree. That was actually quite high price to support the construction of new nuclear power plant. But they're going to use the same approach for lots of different technologies, including offshore wind and other things as well. So the key is to have a way of stabilizing the price that you can charge electricity from your asset. And that will enable you to build a lot of different technologies.
Mark, do you have something?
Well, a few things. First, in Georgia, I mean, the utility is building the plant. They actually asked for like $500 million more to extend the construction time. And this is what happens. Everything gets delayed and they ask for more money because the price isn't stable. Take in New York, the subsidies, for these 3 upstate nuclear power plants, for 12 years, they add up to something like $7 billion. I forget the exact numbers, but it's $7 billion. They're still, even after 12 years, they're going to have to be replaced and shut down, and you have to still spend that amount of money, or I think a little bit less, on replacing them with wind and solar or something like that. So if they just replaced them today with wind and solar and not given the subsidy, they would have saved $7 billion. So it's like a big waste of money. So we're talking about, I'm kind of shocked to hear that there's concern that nuclear is not getting enough subsidy. If you look at the accumulated subsidies of nuclear, it's like the most subsidized energy of any in the United States for over the period of time that it's been around.
Well, even if that were true, and it's not, what I would say to that is, then the answer is, let's get rid of the subsidies. Let's have like I said, let's have a level playing field. I mean, the situation in New York was caused by policies put in place that distorted the prices.
No, it's the opposite. Nuclear's had so much subsidy already. The only way to levelize the playing field is if you start giving the subsidy to others to catch up.
Mark, we've been subsidizing wind and solar for 40 years now. This is not like we started subsidizing it a couple of years ago. I mean, and it's had direct energy subsidies, direct price subsidies, which nuclear has almost never had. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Price guarantee. In nuclear, you have loan guarantees.
Sure. We have loan guarantees for like 4 plants that are under construction now, and a very limited, and there's only 2 are using it. A very limited production tax credit that's been extended to new nuclear. The existing fleet has gotten none of that. Mark, what are you talking about?
Right, I know. I'm talking about accumulated subsidies. That's what I'm talking about.
What's the name of subsidy that you're talking about?
There have been several studies that have been done. I don't have the references with me, but you have the studies that looked at
name the subsidy, even if you don't have.
Okay, I don't want to turn this into a foreshadow of what we're going to see tonight on the debate.
Insurance guarantee.
Yeah, and studies have looked at, a number of studies have looked at the value of the insurance of the insurance, and it's tiny. It's fractions of a cent per kilowatt hour.
Loan guarantees, the accumulated.
You're talking about loan guarantees that don't apply to the existing fleet, Mark. What loan guarantees are you talking about with the existing fleet? Nothing.
They're accumulated over time. Because all these subsidies are over time. You need to look at the references. Look at all the references. You're using selective studies.
No, you can't even name it.
Look at China. China's subsidizing their nuclear program themselves.
I'm going to call a timeout. We're going to change the subject here. On the topic of China, are you concerned with the quality of the facilities being built there? What are the odds of a disaster in China that will set this industry back even further?
3.5 million people die each year from fossil fuel pollution. I can't imagine a disaster at one of those facilities that would kill 3.5 million people. So I'm not at all concerned.
Oh, but the public outrage over a nuclear disaster is far different than the latent kind of effect you're talking about here.
Plausible deniability, just because we can't tell how many thousands of people Volkswagen killed when they lied about their emissions, doesn't mean they didn't kill tens of thousands of people.
A 3 Mile Island, a Chernobyl, a Fukushima in China, what will that do? Is it more plausible, more feasible?
Well, let me say this. I've been to China and talked to the Chinese about this, and talked to many people who have been working with the Chinese. And the NRC has a very good relationship with the Chinese regulators, so there's lots of exchanges. And I would say that perhaps I might have been a bit more concerned say, 6 or 7 years ago than I am today, because the 311 accident, the Japanese accident, was a huge wake-up call for the Chinese. They took that extremely seriously. They've put safety at the very top of the agenda. And to be honest, when I was last in China talking to people in China about their projects, I heard a much more sophisticated discussion about nuclear safety culture in China than I have in some countries that have been operating nuclear power plants for years. And so I think that the Chinese are on a very good path. They do have the challenge that they have a very, very fast program to build very quickly. And so they're going to have to train people, including the regulatory people, to keep up with that expanding infrastructure. It's a challenge, but I think that they are approaching it in a very sober, very serious way. So I'm not nearly as concerned as I might have been 6 or 7 years ago.
Are those being built by the same construction companies, Parsons, Brinkershoff?
No, they've consolidated largely two major builders now, but they've consolidated, and they're also looking at exports as well.
The three issues that we started that I started this list with are the three issues that if you type in nuclear power, this is what's going to come up. And I'm surprised it wasn't something that popped up as critically important in this audience. But waste disposal, safety, weapons proliferation. Which of those concern you the most? Which that concern you the least? Help us understand how to make sense out of these three major technical issues on nuclear power.
Well, waste disposal is a political battleground, not a technical issue. You reprocess your waste, and if you build a fleet of molten salt reactors, you run them on the existing nuclear waste for like 100 years before you have to mine any uranium. So I view it as a resource, not a problem. You can also burn off the nuclear warheads that we don't need. In fact, in the last 20 years, we've burned off a lot of Russia's warheads, and it's contributed to 10% of our electricity. Woo-hoo, that's one of mankind's greatest accomplishments. We should celebrate that and do more. Start on our warheads.
Will we, should we open Yucca Mountain?
No.
We won't, or we shouldn't?
We shouldn't, because the waste produced by a molten salt reactor only has to be watched 300 years. You simply put it in the basement of a building.
Others, we have waste stored at nuclear facilities around the country.
I'll say, I think wherever we store that waste, we should store it in a form where we can reuse it again, because we will sooner or later. And I think we need to start thinking about waste as fuel, and not as something that has to be, There are a bunch of, all three problems that you mentioned are really problems that revolve around a particular kind of risk perception that's completely out of whack with the risk. That doesn't mean that it's not a huge political problem, but the idea that we have to kind of watch this waste for 10,000 or 100,000 years is basically absurd.
But a centralized facility, isn't that what we
No,
should
look, the light water reactor was selected because the waste was the product that was needed for making bombs for the Cold War. If you use the proper reactor, it doesn't make the waste. If there's no waste issue.
Yeah, but even the waste we have, the idea that the standards we apply to it, we apply to no other problem, and you can't, from a rational risk perspective, risk management perspective, justify it. The same is true of our perception of accidents. Do I think that China's fleet is 100% fail-safe and there will not be any accidents? No. I might be a bit more concerned than Bill about that build-out, but the thing that I actually, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I think you could kind of go, wow, a nuclear accident, a civilian nuclear accident could have huge, huge impacts. And there were lots of, the China syndrome, like literally the thing was going to melt through the earth to China. That's why they called it the China syndrome. Well, we actually know now that that's not what nuclear accidents look like. They're actually pretty basic industrial accidents. They're serious. They have consequences. They have to be cleaned up. They have costs. But they are not existential events. The only deaths from significant civilian deaths from a nuclear accident to date were at Chernobyl, where you had Soviet authorities who spent 3 weeks trying to cover it up and didn't hand out iodine tablets because they didn't want anyone in the West to know, along with an open radioactive fire that burned for 3 months in an uncontained reactor. So yeah, if that's how we do future nuclear, you get Chernobyl-like effects, which when you really look at what the actual public health science, after having tracked the impacts for 3 decades now, are, they're actually extraordinarily modest compared to almost any other risk.
Well, especially
set of energy-related risks.
If you actually cared about radioactive waste, the first thing you do is look at the coal ash piles, which are more radioactive than anything near a nuclear plant. Because there's uranium in coal, and it goes in your lungs when it's burned, and it ends up in the ash, and that's 10,000 times as radioactive as anything near a nuclear plant. But do we care about that? No, because the fossil fuel industry is more powerful politically than the nuclear industry.
Let me respond quickly to the three.
Just one quick interruption. If you do want to get to the mics, please come on down. Otherwise, we'll just keep this conversation going.
I think that the issue of waste is one that is, and I think Ted said it correctly, that it's a political issue. It's not really a technical issue. And I think that the issue is going to become easier to deal with over the next several years because several countries, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, France, are all on track to have deep geological repositories licensed and operating in the 2020 time, the 2020s. And that I think will change the discussion because then it will shift from what do you do with it, it's an insolvable problem, to, oh, well, why can't we just do what the Finns just did? And is it because we're not as smart as the Finns, or what is the problem?
But I want to ask one more question, then we'll turn to the mics. I'm glad there's people up there. But Ted, your comment really struck me that the social hurdles that nuclear power faces, nuclear faces social hurdles, renewables face technological hurdles. Who will cross them first? Do you see nuclear becoming accepted within the general public?
I don't think that, I would not bet a nuclear future on getting everybody to change their mind about radiation, honestly.
But they have to vote for politicians. It's like the climate change debate. We're not going to have 100% consensus, but as long as there's a large number of Americans who don't believe climate change is real, senators and congressmen will block any deal.
Well, I'm not sure. Maybe you misunderstood my response.
Maybe I did. Try again.
I said I don't think that. I don't think we're going to just. I wouldn't bet a nuclear future on changing public hearts and minds about radiation and nuclear risk. It'd be great if we could do it, but I think that's a hard thing to do too. Again, I'm not willing to. I don't think I'd bet a renewables future on overcoming a set of the just pretty basic technological hurdles to getting to 100% renewable either.
I would also say, though, that it depends on where you are, because in some parts of the country, people are aggressively wanting to see new nuclear construction in their communities. In other parts, you couldn't even have the conversation. So it depends on what part of the country you are. But just really fast on the proliferation issue, I think it's really important. First, the comment we hear about light water reactors is not really accurate. Light water reactors were not a result of weapons production. That's not the history of it at all. In fact, light water reactors are a really horrible way to make nuclear weapons. If you were trying to make nuclear weapons, light water reactors would not be your first choice by a long shot. But I think the proliferation issue is, again, it looks like we're agreeing with each other. We should get together more often. Because the reality is that it's not the reactors themselves that present any proliferation risk at all, zero risk. It's really the fuel cycle. And if a country, and I think a good example is the United Arab Emirates, they said when they started the program that they had no intention of establishing their own fuel cycle. They didn't want to build enrichment plants. They wanted to stay away from that. And they present zero proliferation concern as a result. It's only when you start getting into trying to develop an enrichment or reprocessing infrastructure does the question even come up. And even if you do that, it's perfectly possible to safeguard that. So I don't think that the expanding nuclear power across the world necessarily has to lead to an expanded risk for nuclear proliferation. So I don't think it's true at all.
So I just want to say that I don't think it's a social issue. I think these are real issues, not just social. Well, we have to get people to believe that there's no problem. I mean, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who we all believe because of their consensus about global warming, I mean, they conclude that there's significant evidence and high agreement that weapons proliferation, meltdown risk, and radioactive waste disposal there's high evidence and significant agreement that these are problems. These are significant
They actually
problems.
say that they're obstacles, that concerns about them are obstacles. They don't actually say that those issues, you're actually misstating.
I'm not giving the exact quote, but there's significant.
Well, yeah,
what you said is misstated.
You've actually edited the quote.
No, I didn't.
In a
Well,
particular
you just misstated what they're concluding, trying to say it's not a problem. They believe it is a problem, and it is. I mean, Iraq tried to develop weapons. That's why Israel bombed their reactor in 1982. Syria was trying to do it. That's why Israel bombed it more recently.
Yeah, and
so many countries.
there was no mystery about what they were doing.
It's not a question of mystery. It's the fuel cycle, as he said. It's the fuel cycle. Is because once you have a reactor, then you have an excuse to import uranium and to try to do other things with it.
Well, and they weren't.
So,
You don't get inspectors in.
The international community agrees there's a problem. You don't. So you're in disagreement with the
Mark,
international
we're going to move to
you're
questions.
misstating
I'm not
IPCC.
misstating. I'm not
Okay.
misstating. I'm not.
We have a question in the right here. Why don't you get started?
So I want to say two things, and I want to say the thing about insurance first, because my second question is actually more important to me. There is no country in the world, to my knowledge, where the private sector insures nuclear power. Now, that may not mean that it would ultimately cost a lot to do it, but what it does mean is that no one believes, no private sector and no government believes yet that this power source is safe enough to insure, because they don't know the ultimate long-term risk. And as long as that's true, many of these arguments seem to me just specious. The second thing that's much more important to me is temporality. I mean, Mark has made a case that we couldn't use nuclear power anyway to get out from under climate change because of the long time cycle to just get the things built. But there are other aspects of temporality that are even more important here, related to safety and waste in particular, and that is the durability of social institutions. Bill talked about the need to get better safety cultures in nuclear power plants. Absolutely right. A much more difficult problem is preserving safety cultures, and that goes for anything to do with nuclear power and waste in the long run. We tend to talk about this stuff, we can think about the time scale of building something, but what we really need to think about with a technology that has toxic waste that is toxic on a species level time scale, we need to think about the durability of institutions that would deal with this stuff, because I love Carl's idea of this, burn it all up. It would be great, but probably not going to happen. We already have ended up with long-term nuclear waste dumps, and we're going to end up with more. And we have the problem of low-level waste that's already in our waste pools and so on. None of those things are, in a context like the United States, we tend to think of our institutions as very durable, and yet we are looking at an election where a lot of our beliefs about that may get overturned. I'll just stop there.
Comment?
Yeah, I'll take the first crack at that. First, I would, on the insurance, and I'm not going to remember exactly which country it is. I think it's either Sweden or Switzerland, but I really can't remember. But at least one of those countries is instituting private sector insurance, and it's costed out, so they're doing it, and they're putting that in place. So it's being done, and I think that for your second point. I think that you have to understand that the whole approach to high-level waste disposal and geological repositories is predicated not on institutions, but on the ability of geologies to contain toxic materials for very long periods of time. That's the whole safety case. And so that's why you look for very stable geologies like salt mines and different types of rock that you have evidence that have lasted for millions of years and will last for millions of more years. So you don't rely on institutions for that. Although I personally, and even when I was with DOE and with the NRC, also believe, again, agreeing with Ted, my best friend here, that if there's technology that we can bring to that question, that we really ought to be doing it, that we ought to be looking at ways of recycling or treating high-level waste to denature it, to take the toxicity out of the material, to reduce the heat load so that it's much, much easier material to dispose of. I think we should be doing that, and it's a shame that we aren't spending more effort on it.
Okay. We have 2 questions. We'll hear these 2, and then we'll wrap it up for the evening. Please, sir.
My name is John Burski. I'm a retired business executive, and I'm an Ann Arbor Energy Commissioner. I'm here today to learn. I don't have any opinions. First of all, I wanted to comment and then ask a question of all of you. A smartphone is a beautiful thing. I just checked some sightings on the internet about subsidies from the IEA's own website. In 2014, subsidies to fossil fuels were $493 billion, which was 10 times the subsidies to renewable energies. And there's another site that is also on the first page where there's an analysis of cumulative subsidies to fossil fuel industry, which shows that, and it doesn't state the period, that it's over 100 times the total subsidies compared to renewables. So I invite everybody to take a look. My question to all of you is, it seems that there's unanimity that, probably in the room, that climate change is a major concern. I would, since the panel's going to be turning over in the speakers in the next 3 days, I'd be interested to hear from each of you. What would you ask us to do in this whole regard? Fight against subsidies, fight for a carbon tax, talk to our representatives. What would each one of you recommend that we do? Thank you.
All right, well, since I'm on this edge, I'll say fight for new technology. We have technologies that worked in 1974 that probably still work today, that solve all these problems at better than 10x or 20x lower cost, make all these hand-wringing problems go away. There's no way to get richer than change technology. And every time we change technology in a significant way, we get richer. So there's no amount of belt tightening that will solve climate collapse.
Ted?
A couple of things. First, just one point on the subsidy sites you just gave. You have to divide those numbers by the amount of kilowatts or energy generated. Because on an annual basis, fossil fuels produce more than 10 times as much energy as the renewables that are being subsidized. You take out biomass and hydro. And secondly, and historically, much more than 100 times as much. So on a per kilowatt or whatever metric you want to use, it's just much, much lower. And most of the global subsidy today is basically developing countries subsidizing fuel costs to poor populations that couldn't afford any energy at all otherwise, which should give us pause when we think that the problem of climate change is that energy is too cheap, because for a lot of people around the world, the problem is exactly the opposite. It's too expensive. So what do I think matters most? I think a couple of things. I think we should be gradualists with the existing technologies we have. I think we need to get as far as we can, as fast as we can, with existing nuclear, building light water reactors where it makes sense, deploying renewables where we can deploy them sensibly, switching from coal to gas, moving to more efficient combustion technologies, the whole suite of it. And then I'm with Carl. We just need to make a really broad portfolio of bets on a pretty broad set of technologies and not be dogmatic about what the technological future is going to look like. And I will put a plug. We've got a new generation of advanced nuclear innovators in this country. Their companies and their technologies look nothing like the nuclear industry that we've come to know. There's legislation in Congress to begin to change the way that we regulate and support innovators in the nuclear sector. and we should be providing that new generation of companies and innovators with as much support as we can to get those technologies to market, because we're going to need them.
Bill?
Well, actually, I agree with both of those comments. I think I think I would agree entirely. I think the one thing I would add is that probably the missing piece that bring all this together is maybe what I call the vision thing. When you think about the way we used to look at the world in this country in the 60s and 70s, particularly even the 50s, it was always very future oriented. We always thought about, how do we make things better? How do we make the next generation? How do we get to the Jetsons? We wanted to be those people, and I quite frankly, I don't think that's us anymore. I don't think we look over that horizon. I don't think we're interested in spending the effort, spending the money, spending the resources to create a vision for the future. When I go to many developing countries, and even when I go to China, people definitely have that feeling. They talk about the desire. Go to Korea. Go to Korea sometime and talk to Koreans about the future. They get so excited talking about making Korea a better, stronger country for the next generation. We just don't talk that way anymore. And I think that's really what's missing. I think the fact that we have lost faith to some degree in the future shows in our everyday decisions. Because if we were taking the future seriously, we'd invest in it. Instead, we spend most of our resources, most of R&D funding, and I wish that Jim Duderstadt were still here, because he's an expert in this. We spend most of our research funding in this country on medical. That's where most of the money goes. And that's where the best and brightest are going. So we're trying to keep all the old people, like some of us in this room, going longer instead of investing in the future to make the world a better place. And that's a misplaced use of our resources. And that's really, I think, the real issue, which is why it's so hard to get any traction on these issues.
Yeah. Well, I just want to point out with subsidy, you also have to account for the social costs, which in the case of fossil fuels is around to the tune of about 15 to 17 cents a kilowatt hour, and 100 million people dead over the last 100 years and 1 billion people ill. So that's an important part of any analysis. With regard to this all of the above policy, I mean, this has been the policy of the United States and the world for the last 20 years, and it's pretty much gone nowhere, except for in the case of renewables has grown. I mean, nuclear has gone nowhere. If you look at worldwide, there are just as many reactors going down as there are being built, so it's not increasing. Coal with carbon capture is another thing that was spent a lot of money on. That's gone nowhere, in fact, negative. So all of the above technologies, they're zero. I mean, last year, though, wind and solar primarily were 70% of the new electricity in the United States and 100% in Europe. And so that's where the growth is. But speaking of that, what can you guys do? That was the question. Well, there's two things. On the personal level, everybody here can make their own steps to electrify your home. You can replace gas heaters with heat pumps, air source heat pump, air heaters, water heaters, induction cooktop stoves, electric dryers if you have a gas dryer. Get gas off your property, electric cars. You can insulate your home. Efficiency is the best way to go forward. So you don't need gas in your property to go forward. You can electrify everything, reduce your power demand. Otherwise, except for things that you can do on your own, it becomes a policy issue. You have to decide what you want as the future, and so it's really pushing forward the policies to your policymakers about what you want to see in the future. And the fact is, the easiest thing to implement is things that exist, not things that might exist in 10 years or 20 years. You can't make decisions based on, this technology might be available in 15 years. You have to see what's on the ground available today. And what's on the ground today that you can actually implement on a large scale is clean renewable energy. So there's no reason not to try that. If it doesn't work, you can always fall back on these other technologies. But it just makes no sense to just say, well, we shouldn't do anything. We should hope that some companies come along and make better technologies.
Okay, last question. No pressure, but it better be a good one.
That's a great point. What he just made there is, I want to make the point that you're harping on this ridiculous notion that speed to deployment is this number one thing to hold up as a solution. And it absolutely is not. There's no sense to deploying $1 trillion worth of so-called renewables only to find out they do almost nothing to solve the problem. Another thing you have to get out of your head is that renewables are not magic come out of nowhere. I did a lot of work with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And you got to remember, these pretty little glass solar cells are made with some of the most poisonous, toxic substances around, okay? And so when you're decommissioning a solar cell with tellurium and other heavy metals in it, what are you going to do with that, with hundreds of millions of square feet and meters of that? And you also have to understand, every single windmill contains vast amounts of rare earths. Almost every energy source contains large amounts of rare earths. We're 100% dependent on China for that. We're not 100% dependent on China for our nuclear power. We're going to
Is there a question
for China.
What's that? A question?
Yeah, the question is coming. So with the idea that electric power and power in general is deadly, people die from solar cells, people die from windmills, people die from natural gas explosions. Get it out of your head that there's one thing that isn't dangerous and other things that are dangerous. You know, one way we could present that is, would you guys support a decommissioning cost up front, the way nuclear has to pay decommissioning up front for solar and wind and some of these other, especially later on, we find out especially how potently poisonous and hard to dispose of these things are?
I would take that. I'd like to see a decommissioning cost on coal. That would put the mountains back where they used to be and put all that coal ash someplace and also sequester the carbon. I think we'd have no coal at that point. All of these energy systems need to be compared by the number of fatalities that they generate. And nuclear actually comes out ahead of wind and solar, to my surprise. People fall off roofs installing solar. Almost nobody dies by nuclear. But sadly, we have a regulatory agency whose business is simply trying to make nuclear safer, and it already kills 0 people per year. So they have to do a lot of crazy stuff. Whereas we have nobody trying to make coal safer, and that kills, worldwide fossil fuels, as I mentioned, kill 3.5 million people a year by air pollution. So hand-wringing over what's going to happen with nuclear waste is completely irrelevant compared to what's already happening with fossil fuel air pollution.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
Well, I'll just talk about the mortalities. I mean, nuclear from Fukushima alone, just the evacuation killed 1,100 people. I mean, so I don't want to ignore that. And the projections, which we're called conservative, from the radioactive fallout is not large, but on the order of 1,000 people over their lifetime. Yeah, small compared to zero. So I don't want to say it's zero, but it's small. So that's not the major problem with it. But there is the land devastation around the whole area of Fukushima. I mean, it's not like just the area around it. It's like, I don't know what the numbers are. There's a huge swaths of land are uninhabitable for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no scientific evidence to support that there were any radiation-related deaths coming out of Fukushima. I mean, it's projected deaths based on the international transport. You can calculate what you like, but I mean, it's not what we like. It's based on published papers. There's just no evidence to support that. But I think that you're just in denial. No, we've published it and it's been peer reviewed. Well, because you published it, and some of the Nobel Prize winners.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking the panel for coming out tonight.